watching this with us or viewing this later. This is a News and Then chat. News and Then is a project of PBS and WGBH, which is the Boston affiliate station for PBS. And it's a project that's aimed at generating conversations that connect present-day issues to historical struggles for social justice and American history specifically. So one of the things we really want to do is generate connections, to help people make connections between contemporary issues and American history, and have deeper conversations and deeper understanding of how the issues that are relevant to Americans today are part of a long history that continues to have a legacy today. So our conversation today is with Professor Koritha Mitchell, who is a professor in the English department at Ohio State University, and specifically specializing in African American literature. And she's written a book called Living with Lynching, which looks at lynching plays in the early 20th century. Is that correct,
yes.
Koritha? Yes. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this today is that this week is the 97th anniversary of the Silent Parade, which was a protest organized by the NAACP in 1917 after the East St. Louis riots that destroyed hundreds, thousands of black homes, displaced thousands of black residents of East St. Louis, and killed dozens of black Americans in St. Louis. So it was a protest organized in response to those riots, and also more generally in response to lynching and other anti-black violence. And I'm going to share an image of this from the protest. In doing research for what I wanted to talk about this week, I came across these images of from the Silent Parade, and I was just really struck by, first of all, just how powerful this image is. It's a protest that brought together somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 predominantly black Americans to assert black citizenship and the right to black survival, and to be treated like any citizen with full rights, and to live free of violence. So they were just really powerful images, but I was also struck by the fact that I hadn't seen these images before, that they're not as widely disseminated as other images of lynching. For example, the postcards that were circulated of black corpses hanging from trees or from bridges, that we've seen those images before, but these images of black resistance are much less familiar to the American public. So this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, Koritha, because your work speaks specifically to this. What are the images of lynching that endure in the American imagination, and why do they endure in the American imagination? So I just wanted to start by giving you a chance to summarize what your book is about and how you came on the topic, why you were interested in it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for thinking of my work in this context in particular, because you're exactly right. It's the same impulse that you had that led me to be interested in this. I mean, one way to understand it is, here I am studying kind of the turn of the century, and constantly it's being framed as the nadir, the lowest point of race relations, and with good reason, right? I mean, lynching is part of the reason for that, and the anti-black violence is part of the reason for that. And so part of what I was interested in is, okay, if not only can you be lynched, but also pictures of your mutilated body will circulate in newspapers and circulate as picture postcards, then your country is very clearly telling you that you are not a citizen. So
Right.
My question was, how did black people keep believing in their right to full citizenship? How did they not believe the hype, basically, that they deserved this kind of treatment? And so I was interested in what those survival tactics might be, and I knew that you couldn't get it from those lynching photographs. So, for example, when they had the exhibition of the lynching photographs in Atlanta, which was one of the most thoughtful presentations of those postcards that I've ever seen, and I've tried to go to every exhibition that those photographs have been displayed. And that was one of the most thoughtful. And you had families there, literally bringing their children there and exposing them to this information. And in some cases, actually saying, okay, you have family members who are represented here. I want you to understand what your people have come through. Right. And as I watched that kind of powerful moment among generations of Black families, my heart kind of ached, because I thought, there's power in what they're trying to hand down, but there's also a limit to what you can receive from photographs that are taken from the perspective of perpetrators, right? And that, I think, is what we miss. We miss that these photographs were taken from a particular perspective, so they can only offer you so much. They can only offer you the perspective of someone who is safe at this lynching, which means that they're going to replicate the message that the lynchers are given. And I don't think we have understood just how limiting it can be to go to something that is designed for one particular message and hope that we can get a different message from it. So that is a big part of what had me really interested in exactly what you wanted to point out is, why haven't we seen these protest parade, the silent protest parade images circulate? And I think it has something to do with what you said, right? You called it Black resistance. And part of what I'm interested in the book is actually thinking about it in terms of Black affirmation. That they already saw themselves as dignified, right? This is the reason for their dignified presentation with the suits, with the white dresses. They're seeing themselves in a very particular way, and they're going into the streets to further assert what they already know in their own communities.
Great, thanks for setting that up for us. So I wonder if you could also explain for people who are watching what a lynching drama is, and also why, I noted when I was reading your book that you talked about moving from the vocabulary of talking about an anti-lynching drama to talking about it as lynching drama. So if you could just set the stage a little bit for what that is for viewers.
Absolutely. So the project started when I came across the anthology of lynching plays written by women. It was called Strange Fruit, Plays on Lynching by American Women, and it came out in 1998 when I was in graduate school. And the authors, the editors of that anthology define a lynching play as a play in which the threat or occurrence of a lynching, past or present, has major impact on the dramatic action. So that's the basic definition of a lynching play. So it's not simply that a lynching is referenced, but it's actually that the lynching somehow shapes the dramatic arc. And so that's the basic definition. And part of what it seems to me that's so powerful about these plays is that they really do focus on Black families, Black homes. They don't show you any of the violence outside, right? The violence on that tree or that bridge or that telephone pole. They really focus on what happens before, during, and after the lynching for these families, and sometimes generations after. These are short plays very often, but they actually deal with what's happening generations later. So part of what I think is so interesting in terms of connecting it to your points about the protest parade is that what I find is that the genre really develops around key figures that these people who are surviving mob violence want to make sure that they are lifting up and emphasizing. So what you find is that, again, in affirming themselves, in reminding each other who they really are as people and citizens, they lift up soldiers, lawyers, and mothers who are also wives. And I think that's really the crux of the work that's going on here. Who do we know ourselves to be? Are we only going to respond to what they're claiming we are in terms of being criminals who should be hung on this tree? Or are we going to actually remember that we know who who's in our homes. We know who's in our community even. These plays very often give us a sense of how the community is mourning someone who has been attacked. So it's not simply that nuclear family, it's the larger community that's saying, we're not going to believe the lies that you've told to justify this lynching.
I mentioned to you when we were discussing over email what to touch on in this hangout. That as I was reading your book, I kept thinking about Fruitvale Station, and specifically, just for any viewers who haven't seen it, Fruitvale Station is a dramatization of the last day in the life of Oscar Grant, who was shot in the back at Fruitvale Station in Oakland, California. I can't remember exactly how old he was, but he was in his early 20s. He was African American, and the cop who shot him was a white man. And there was a trial, and it was his shooting was actually caught on video as well. So it ties into some of what you're talking about, Koritha, about the dissemination of images of brutalization of black bodies, and that video was pretty widely circulated. All that to say, last year, a movie came out dramatizing the last day in the life of Oscar Grant, and I was struck at the time, when I saw it, about what seemed to be the messages that the filmmaker, I believe his name is Ryan Coogler, was trying to send. The scenes that precede the shooting and the full unfolding of the shooting are scenes of Oscar with his partner, with his daughter, with his mother, and his extended family, with his partner's extended family, and showing them in this family context, showing him, trying to get a job, trying to get his job back, actually, trying to sort of get things together so he can provide for his family, spending time with his friends. Like, it's a very family and community-oriented portrayal of the last day of his life. And there's also this really interesting scene where, which I believe was a fictionalized scene for the movie, where he sees a dog hit by a car and sort of holds the dog as it dies, and he's crying, and sort of a parallel to what's going to happen to him later, this innocent guy who's cut down in the prime of his life for no reason, but also showing him as an empathetic and compassionate person. And I thought about this particularly because there was some pushback from some columnists on the portrayal of Grant in the movie, that it was too positive, that it was too idealized, because he smoked weed and he had been in prison and all of this other stuff, and wasn't this basically like a hagiographic account of his life, trying to whitewash the darker aspects of his life, which I found a really interesting argument, that by just depicting him as being part of a community and part of a family and loving his family and being invested in his community, that was somehow erasing any other less savory things that he might have done in his life, or that the unsavory things, however we would frame that, assuming that is an objective portrayal in the first place, but that those were the things that needed to be emphasized, and that it was somehow wrong of the filmmaker to leave those parts out, and that would change the viewer's perception of whether or not the killing of Oscar Grant at the end of the movie was justified or a tragedy. So I wonder, just what that brings up for you with in relation to living with lynching, because I saw a lot of strong parallels there.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that so much. I mean, part of what's powerful to me about the way that you've described that and thinking about other connections that we've seen very recently, right? The degree to which many of us have been talking about how in this country, even after you're dead, if you're not white, you can be put on trial, right? So Trayvon Martin and his supposed weed smoking becomes this, focal point. Right
Mm-hmm.
now with Renisha McBride, there is all of this attempt to, basically taint her character,
Right.
even in death. And so part of what's powerful about that, right, is here you are giving us an example of when you try to show someone's humanity if they're black, then that becomes hagiography.
Mm-hmm.
Now, putting them on trial after death, that makes sense. But to actually show something more balanced becomes automatically some kind of mythologizing that is way too positive. So I think that tells us something, right, about the consistency of this country, the investment that dominant discourse continues to have in making sure that it never needs to be accountable for the crimes against black people and black communities. And so everything you're saying makes me think about one of the things I learned from writing Living with Lynching. And I guess really we could learn this from all kinds of things, right? But it seems to me that we really need to get real about the fact that how you can talk about me very much dictates how you can treat me. And we see that over and over again. So the pushback you're describing to Fruitvale Station is illustrating that, right? How he was treated is justified by the fact that you're so easily able to label a black man as a criminal who, of course, the police are terrified of and who, of course, they're going to use extra force against. The fact that we're always talking about black people as violent means that you can do whatever you need to do to them. And then, as scholar David Leonard says, and then always be able to manufacture white innocence. It doesn't really matter what white people do or what whiteness does in the mainstream, but the innocence can always be manufactured in that direction. And it seems to me that that is what you're really illustrating with this. And I think it's really painful to see the degree to which it's happening yet again with the Renisha McBride, trial that's starting.
Yeah.
So.
One thing you just reminded me of was I was struck by a section of the book where you talked about how the image of black men as rapists sort of produced this cultural truth that this is why lynchings happened, even though the vast majority of lynchings had nothing to do with even a claimed rape.
Even a claim.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So how this, exactly what you're saying, that the repetition of the creation of a meme, the creation of a stereotype, sort of creates this cultural truth that justifies any potential violence, current, past, future, just by virtue of the fact that that is accepted as a cultural truth.
Absolutely. And what I guess we have to be attentive to, right? And what your Fruitvale Station example helps us to really start to unpack is how much we can move from a really powerful stereotype or image or assumption, right? Black rapist. We don't hear that spoken anymore in the way that it was at the time of the plays that I study in Living with Lynching. But without question, we hear criminal. And when you say criminal, automatically it's not a white person. No matter how much crime happens in white communities to other communities or within white communities, that criminal always seems black or brown. So it seems to me that that's part of what we have to deal with, is what is the function that the label criminal is now serving, that the label rapist used to serve. And we see this played out in many ways. We see this in terms of always assuming that a black person is a criminal, justifying Oscar Grant. Assuming that a black person is a criminal, justifying mass incarceration, what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. The fact that you can have your life chances just cut down, even as a teenager, over minor drug infractions, because the label criminal and felon does so much work. It fills in the blanks. It makes you into a menace to society, period. And that's the only frame through which people are looking at you. So I think that we have to be attentive to the extent to which, the exact same way that black rapist used to function, we now have words like criminal, I would even dare say immigrant. We have words like that, images like that, functioning in the same powerful way to fill in blanks with lies.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about specifically the intersections of race and gender. Not, both with respect to your work and also sort of what the contemporary implications of it are. One thing that's notable about the popular imagination of lynching is that the bodies that we see depicted are almost always male, right? And the fact that the dominant image of lynching is this, isolated, violated black body surrounded by white viewers, white spectators, white participants, perpetrators, I think is the word that you use frequently in the book, also sort of exacerbates that erasure of black women from the popular imagination around like what lynching meant and what anti-black violence means now. So I wonder if you could fill in that blank a little bit for viewers.
Absolutely. First of all, we definitely have plenty of research to show, and even a few photographs, not as many, that black women, and white women too, actually, but black women were certainly victims of lynching. I would say the best work on that has really come from Crystal Feimster, a historian who has really looked at the role of women and lynching, whether they be black or white, whether they be anti-lynching activists or pro-lynching activists. Mm-hmm. She's really done the most thorough job of that. But what I find interesting and what Living with Lynching kind of engages is the degree to which when black women were lynch victims, very often they were raped before they were lynched. Very often they were lynched because they fought back, trying not to be raped. Very often, even when we're dealing with male victims, we have a dynamic that very much involves women, because very often it was because they were, for example, trying to protect their wives from being sexually assaulted in some way, that said, you know what, you don't know your place. If you knew your place, you would know that it is my prerogative and you need to remember what your place is. So all of that for me is about, so when we have these figures that I focus on, right, the black soldier, the black lawyer, the black mother who's also a wife, in every instance we're dealing with gender. We're dealing with what is the work of racism in telling black citizens how they are not citizens, how they can be put in their so-called proper place according to their gender, right? So right. The fact that you think you can protect your own body as a black woman, that's something you need to be put in place. Black men trying to protect you, right? So all of that is very gendered. So it seems to me that you're right, though. We have to also deal with the degree to which, as historians, as American readers in general, we are more drawn, it seems to me, in some ways, to images of black men. And that's partly because, as a community, we do want to rally against rally around men because we're in a patriarchal society. So since we're in a patriarchal society, naturally the people who should be leaders are men. And so if men are under fire, then that means somehow we're under even greater attack. And I think that over and over again throughout our history, we've seen the degree to which men and women of marginalized communities like to rally behind the men of their communities. I mean, obviously, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking about the "Why We Can't Wait" hashtag, right? And thinking about the degree to which Kimberly Crenshaw and other scholars are really rallying to say Black women and girls need to be a part of this Your Brother's Keeper initiative. Mm-hmm. And the push for that has everything to do with the question that you're asking, right? It has everything to do with, can we get real about the fact that Black experiences are affected by gender? Black experiences are affected by sexuality. White privilege is shaped by gender. The way that I exercise my privilege as a white person has a lot to do with whether I'm a white man or whether I'm a white woman, right? It's no less applicable in terms of white privilege. So those kind of dynamics, I think we need to get more used to unpacking and dealing with. And I guess part of what you're making me think about is the degree to which part of the privilege of whiteness is perhaps not having to get more sophisticated about that. If you're in a marginalized community, I think that's why we need to push even more to get sophisticated about that, and why I think, you know, the hashtag Why We Can't Wait is so crucial, because it's a push to get more sophisticated about this in the present moment. Oh, but you also brought up perpetrator, right? And how the fact that we think about Black rapist myth and the fact that it's so easy to cast someone as a perpetrator, the function that that has in terms of gender. And I guess part of what you had me thinking when you said that, I'm thinking, for example, of great work by a scholar at UCLA, Sarah Haley, and she's working on a book where she really deals with how Black women have been criminalized over time, and in particular, how often Black women were part of chain gangs, but our history has written that out. So she tells a story, for example, of going to the archives and telling the archivist that she's looking for these materials. And she sits there and she looks through the materials and is watching these images and finding not only images but also written evidence that Black women were on these chain gangs, and that time and time again, white women were kept from being on them, even if they were in the same criminal justice system. And the archivist says to her at one point, oh, well, we did a lot of things, but we didn't do that to women, right? So it really taps into what you're saying, that as a nation, I guess, we are interested in forgetting certain things. We're interested in ignoring what the archive tells us about certain things, right? And so for me, that links to what you're saying about, okay, here we are focused on the brutalized Black body, but what about these dignified Black bodies? And, you know, it cuts so many different ways with the gender example, because here we are erasing the truth about what happened to Black women on chain gangs, that to make Black women into perpetrators was part of basically ensuring that they couldn't be seen as women, so then you can treat them like men. So that's part of, feels to me like that's part of the intersectional analysis that you're having us think about today.
Yeah, and you know, just what you just said made me think of the way in which mainstream rhetoric around, or mainstream understandings around gender equality take as a starting point, this is women's experience, when it really, it only really makes sense if you put the identity label white in front of that women. Yeah. So, women haven't been able to own property. Well, that only makes sense if you're talking about a group in which the men were allowed to own property to begin with, right?
Exactly.
Or, you know, women were forced into marriage. Well, slave women's marriages weren't, if they were allowed to get married officially, those marriages weren't respected, and in many cases they weren't allowed to. So, but the way in which we talk about women as an undifferentiated sort of universal category takes as the starting point the experience of free white women, and erases, just by definition, the reality of women who were enslaved, black women who were enslaved. And we see that still today with the recurring debate over whether women can have it all. Should you stay at home or should you work outside of the home? And glossing over the fact that women of color and poor women have always had to work outside of the home, often taking care of other families' children, and not having the privileges of taking care of their own children, even when they wanted to.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, part of what feels key to me about that, you have me thinking in two directions with that. I mean, one is the default, right? How powerful language can be when we don't acknowledge what the defaults are. And that's why it's so powerful that you're naming that, right? Whenever we can name whatever operates as an invisible norm, I think we take power that would otherwise be denied to us. So whenever I can mark whiteness, I do. Whenever I can mark heteronormativity, I do, right? That it's not simply about what supposed disadvantages I have by not being in this normative category. It's about, how about we actually mark that category, show that it's not normative, but actually advantaged. Let's talk about unearned advantage that just flows in your direction. So that's what's powerful to me about that. But with the degree to which you want us to think about differentiating the category of woman, I can't help but also think about the work that I'm working on now, which is, I'm calling it homemaking anxiety. And part of what I'm interested in is, in the same way that we've erased that black women were on chain gangs, for example, it feels to me like one of the other major projects of erasure has been to erase black success. So with writing Living with Lynching, I learned that most often the reason you were targeted is not because you were a criminal, but because you were successful and therefore didn't know your place, right? So this has led me to speak very often in terms of know your place aggression. I like to talk about that as, going from microaggression all the way up to murder, that it's all about making you know your place. And it feels to me like part of what has happened, at least over the last 100 years, which is the period that I'm looking at for the book I'm working on now, is that time and time again, the existence of successful, traditionally defined successful black nuclear families, heteronormative black nuclear families, their very existence has been constantly erased. So part of what I'm interested in is the fact that, yes, absolutely, there are very often situations in which black women were not able to embody that privileged position. But what's so fascinating to me is, even when they were able to, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, on up to Michelle Obama, somehow that doesn't shift anything about how black women are seen, about how black families are seen. Somehow it doesn't shift how often we think of black communities as being full of unwed mothers, baby mamas, welfare queens, deadbeat dads. Like, that's the only way that in mainstream discourse we figure as somehow intimately connected. Right. So that erasure feels to me like know your place aggression. That no matter what, I'm not going to be recognized as someone who's, married in a heteronormative nuclear family construction. That's just not going to register for people. And I would say that that's exactly the work that lynching accomplished when it insisted that you could be raped for resisting sexual advances, lynched for resisting those sexual advances, and also when it insisted that black men could be lynched for trying to protect you from that. It's the same kind of erasure, it seems to me. So this is the last thing I'll say. So as I say that, it makes me think about a question someone asked me last night. And she wanted me to talk about, the power of the Cosby Show. and what it has meant to not have that image circulating in recent decades. And part of what I left that conversation thinking about is the degree to which the erasure of that success is part of what I'm talking about. When I say that acknowledging that families that you claim American society will automatically respect. You say, okay, black people, if you would just get it together and have this heteronormative nuclear family construction, we could respect you. You could be a citizen. But time and time again, black people have done that, and it hasn't resulted in that. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in us getting real about that, and it feels to me like if we did, we would not invest so much in propriety. We wouldn't invest so much in, trying to make these claims about having nuclear families. We would get real about how the nuclear family is simply not the be-all, end-all. Yeah. How heterosexuality just isn't the be-all, end-all. I think we need to, really get real about what rewards are not coming with it and haven't been coming with it ever.
Right, and what you're speaking to is this discussion of black respectability politics, right? And the fact that respectability will not save you.
Never.
It's not because it's not an issue. I think it ties into what you were saying earlier in interesting ways about black self-affirmation. That it's not for white audiences. It's for black. It's for ourselves, right? Yeah. Because that will never. There is not a white audience for that, right? Which is proven precisely by some of the examples that you mentioned of the Obamas, for example, that people are threatened by the fact that they are this normative, successful, well-educated, polished, elegant family. That makes people angry. That makes people feel threatened.
Yeah. So this is why I call it know your place aggression, right? Because if you go ahead and embody everything the nation says that it's going to respect, that's going to make people want to put you in your place. Whether it's Barack Obama, those images of him floating around the internet in a noose, whether it's the life-size dummies that look like Barack Obama that are hanging from trees, whether it is Clint Eastwood doing his empty chair routine at the Republican National Convention, and then the very next day you had empty chairs hanging from nooses on trees in my home state of Texas. So if that doesn't tell you that black success beckons the mob, I don't know what does. So if we got real about what our success has actually meant, that our success can bring praise, but just as often it can bring aggression, violence, death. And if we really deal with that, then our investment in so-called success for certain reasons wouldn't be so high. Like, we would have other reasons to attach to these, goals or whatever. It wouldn't simply be citizenship, which we more than deserve, but we have to understand that citizenship isn't acknowledged according to the stated rules, that our nation has always stated rules and then not applied them to us. So, it feels to me that that's part of what we have to get real about.
Yeah. I thought it was also interesting the point you raised in the book about the paradox that you're speaking to now of being expected to the hidden orthodoxy, right, is that black families and black individuals cannot live up to this standard of success, and that orthodoxy is necessary to maintain the other hidden and not so hidden orthodoxy of white superiority, right?
Yeah.
So black success is a threat because it challenges that orthodoxy. You said earlier the manufacturing of white innocence, along with that is the manufacturing of white superiority, right? And people like the Obamas or Oprah or whoever challenge the stability of that orthodoxy and therefore either have to be exceptionalized or degraded in some way. And yet, at the same time, they're also held up as examples of why racism no longer exists, right?
That's exactly where I was headed, right? Is that very often what black success how it's discussed is that it's the thing that I can bludgeon other black people over the head with. That mainstream discourse can bludgeon other people of color over the head with that success. So the success does not get talked about, especially in dominant discourse, as evidence of that person's exceptional struggle. It gets talked about as proof that nothing needs to change about society because look at them, and proof that you're trifling. Like, that's the only way it functions. It doesn't function to say, you know what, they overcame exceptional obstacles, and the reason it's important to talk about that is because we should really be removing some of these exceptional obstacles that are really unwarranted. That's not why we talk about it in a mainstream context. It's always to suggest that other people are somehow lacking. And that, for me, is another form of that, I mean, aggression, really, you know. But as you said, too, those figures, they're getting a certain kind of praise, but they're also getting aggression. Because, as I said, if you can have the Obamas endure some of the things that they've endured, and even when we look at the Secret Service book, and I'm not going to remember it right now, I know I quoted it in an essay I wrote called Love in Action, but the book about the Secret Service actually documents that, according to what we can tell so far, death threats against the president went up 400%. That was literally the statistic, 400% over when George Bush was in office. So to me, that suggests that we really need to understand that talking about these so-called exceptional figures always also comes with some kind of underlying violence that we shouldn't be ignoring, and we shouldn't allow other people to ignore in their discussions either.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to the point that you were talking about having more sophisticated discussions, more sophisticated imagery, more sophisticated narratives, more sophisticated archives. One of my favorite books is it's this really short book by Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who's a Haitian historian, called Silencing the Past. And I believe the subtitle is Power in the Production of History. And I was just looking at it this morning, and in the preface, he talks about how history is a fruit of power, but power itself is never so transparent that its analysis becomes superfluous. The ultimate mark of power may be its invisibility, the ultimate challenge, the exposition of its roots. And one of the examples he talks about in sort of building this argument is the creation of archives, which is a subject that you speak to in the book, and what we think of as objective evidence, and how we interpret evidence as objective, what we think it means. So he gives examples, for instance, of how the French elite wrote about Haiti in the leading up to the revolution and Haitian independence, versus the looking at the experience from the perspective of actual enslaved Haitians who were fighting for independence, and he talks about sort of the presumed narratives on the part of French elites, like Haitians couldn't possibly revolt because blacks are not capable of organizing any kind of resistance that sophisticated, things like this, that shaped the history and the accounts they were giving in ways that they didn't even realize at the time, and even historians now have not fully reckoned with. All of that to say that one of the larger points he's making is that the documents that are left behind for us as the building blocks of a historical narrative are they're the creations of people just as much as historical narratives are, right?
Exactly.
And which is one of the things that you talk about with what does it mean to see images of lynched black bodies as the predominant objective evidence of what lynching meant versus documents and embodied practices that were produced by the communities that actually suffered and lived with lynching. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Absolutely. I mean, that question of archives, why are things preserved, is really, really important to the work that I'm trying to do in Living with Lynching, because I think you're exactly right. We haven't been aware of the degree to which the documents that we have, or the artifacts that we have in those photographs, we haven't been aware of how much they actually are formulated by the people who created them. We saw it as objective because, well, photography is objective. How could you not have some kind of objective record if you snapped the picture and you took it? But the truth is, photographs include a certain perspective. There are conventions to how these photographs were taken that influences. So I talk about that in the book. But I guess part of what I'm interested in there is, for us to continue that work. So especially given the conversation we've had today, you're making me think about if there's this erasure around the kinds of documents or artifacts that are preserved and interpreted, and histories are written based on them. If there's an erasure in terms of, for example, Black women who were on chain gangs, then we also have to look at whatever biases we might be bringing. So that has me thinking about, part of what was inspirational for me with Living with Lynching and actually feeling valid about looking at what people would call less objective material, right? Mm-hmm. So the photographs seem objective, but testimonies of victimized communities doesn't seem. Part of what made me feel like it was valid to do that is I knew of earlier scholarship on the period of slavery, right? Mm-hmm. The slave community, John Blassingame, and the way that that book really shaped what work historians did after that point on slavery. Suddenly, it was no longer acceptable to write about slavery only from the perspective of the archives kept by those who were masters. Mm. People started to actually think, oh, wait, that actually won't give you a complete picture. That actually gives you a very specific picture. That's why I felt valid if we move toward the lynching period, which so often we conveniently skip over, right? We talk about slavery, then we start talking about the civil rights movement. Nothing in between supposedly happened, right? But that move that he made allowed me to think very seriously about what would it mean to take seriously the artifacts that are left from people who were victimized. And so I would say that, that's just to say that you're exactly right. I appreciate that you're highlighting that as one of the major things that the book is trying to do, because I'm very invested in making sure that we hold as valid, all of us as American readers, hold as valid those kinds of artifacts and that kind of evidence. But where I was headed with that too, in terms of thinking about how do I move from taking that inspiration from John Blassingame and his study of slavery to looking at this period and then looking about ahead to the other work that I'm interested in doing. And I will admit to you that it's thinking about the fact that people are making these artifacts and people are interpreting artifacts to write histories is part of why I was so invested in trying to think about LGBT communities and the violence against those communities, and what archives, what artifacts, what do we have to understand what's going on from that perspective, and how can we make sure that we're not somehow erasing something really important about the violence that marginalized communities are experiencing. Are we erasing again an aspect of those victims' identities and thereby not telling a complete story? So I will admit to you that the question you're asking about archives, artifacts, and also the perspectives that we illuminate from them is very much driving the work that I've done on violence against LGBT communities as well, trying to make sure that, yeah.
And I want to come back to that, the connections that you've drawn between lynching and anti-LGBT violence, because I think that's a really interesting and important point of connection to contemporary issues that we're discussing more explicitly now in 21st century America. But I also wanted to talk a little bit more about this notion of visual evidence as objective and the privileging of visual evidence as sort of real proof. One of the things that I always find interesting and disturbing whenever there's an incident like the murder of Oscar Grant or of Trayvon Martin, the most recent case with Eric Garner, where there's some kind of visual evidence left behind of the violence that occurred, is how rapidly these images circulate. Yeah. I mean, just from a purely, this is speaking to a binary in the way I'm still thinking about this, but purely from an emotional perspective, thinking as, if I were a family member of, Eric Garner's or Oscar Grant's, how would I feel about the fact that footage of my family member dead or dying is considered fodder for, the daily news, and which bodies are acceptable to display in that state of death or dying, because we don't see white bodies displayed in that same way, right? There are a few exceptions, with Bosnia is one of the few examples that I can think of, but even there you have sort of a remove, that's Eastern Europe, right, versus the kinds of white communities that we see predominantly represented in American culture. So for me, there's a question of just from sort of an empathetic point of view of what does it mean that we circulate these kinds of images, and then also what are the implications of the logic that the ultimate proof of violence against the community is seeing the dead body or or someone in the process of dying, and how does that itself reinforce or reinstantiate a kind of violence against those communities, and also the fact that the idea is that visual proof is the ultimate proof, but it's never enough. Never. Even if it's being circulated, there's still an open question of what really happened with Oscar Grant, what really happened with Eric Garner. That it's never a closed question. So that itself calls into doubt this idea that you need to see the body in death or in dying to prove that violence is really happening.
Wow. Now you really have touched on, we could have an entire class on this question, seriously, because I think you're so right about the impossible position that you're illustrating, right? That so often the violence and aggression against marginalized communities is denied, right? Mm-hmm. So in some ways you can understand this impulse to prove. No, look, here, no, seriously, here it is. Look for yourself. But as you said, somehow that's never enough. There's still an open question about what actually happened. So the impossibility of that for me feels like kind of the core of violence, the core of denying one's belonging, denying one's citizenship. So for me, the way that you've articulated that and made us feel the impossibility of that, for me, is sort of the definition of marginalized, right? Mm-hmm. That even when you're the victim, you're somehow the perpetrator. All of those kind of contradictions, for me, are the definition of what it means to be socially marginalized, and to have your citizenship never acknowledged, to have the fact that you belong never acknowledged. So for me, you've really just articulated the impossibility perfectly, and that is what defines marginalization to me. So So I can't do any better than that. Yeah, because of course you have me thinking about, other people's work, about, the degree to which Black and brown bodies suffering is a kind of pastime for American culture writ large, right? And so what does that mean? But that bumps against the urge that marginalized communities have felt to try to give that evidence, right? That's part of where the tension comes in. So yeah.
Yeah, and thinking about at what point do these become images that people are just consuming without really digesting, really internalizing.
Yes. And see, okay, that's the other thing I wanted to say about this. Earlier when I was saying that I saw the families trying to get something from lynching photographs that those photographs could not give, I feel like this is related to that question. There is no way to control the meaning-making power of images, the meaning-making power of embodied practices, gestures, facial expression. There's meaning-making power in all of those dynamics, and there's no way to completely control what that meaning will be for different audiences. So it seems to me that, again, the impossibility that you describe, we need the visual evidence, but somehow it's never enough. That impossibility has a lot to do with the fact that we can't control how these things are seen. So as much as you want to use, another example you gave was the gruesome images from Palestine right now in the Gaza Strip, there's no way to dictate how that is digested. So it feels to me like that's the slippery work, and that's the reason why it's so important for us to be very deliberate and analytical about the framing that we bring to things and acknowledge the framing that happens. So for me, part of what I mean by that is when you have us think about the importance of marking whiteness, not letting it go unmarked. When we think about marking heteronormativity or heterosexism and not letting it go unmarked, and so on. When we do that, part of what we're doing is we're being deliberate about our framing and pushing other people to be deliberate about the framing too. Because no matter what those violent images are, whether it's Eric Garner or Oscar Grant or the Gaza Strip right now, there's always room for interpretation. So we've got to be deliberate in our framing in every conversation and push other people to do so too.
We're just talking about the idea of visual evidence, whether it's images of lynching victims or images of casualties in Palestine and the Gaza Strip, or Eric Garner or Oscar Grant, what it means that these kinds of images are seen as the ultimate proof, yet don't actually seem to prove what they are said to prove. And I wanted to ask Koritha to elaborate on the way your book pushes back on this idea of visual evidence as the ultimate proof, and the deliberate choice you made to pick sources that I think, as you said earlier, are seen as less objective, and what you can learn from those sources, and what perspective that offers.
Yeah, it's such a rich question. I mean, to try to maybe focus in on what I'm trying to do in the book, it had to do with first getting to the point where I really understood just how particular the perspective from which lynching photographs were taken was, right? To actually get real about, wait a second, what did you need to be able to take this photograph? You needed to be safe. And then what is the message that constantly comes through? This isolated figure surrounded by a mob of righteous whites, no grieving loved ones in sight. It gives a very particular message, a very particular perspective. So once I got real about the fact that that was a particular perspective on the victim and the importance of that being what circulates, then that's what gave me the understanding of how important it was to actually give voice to what isn't the message of those photographs, right? The fact that this person wasn't isolated at all, but was connected to institutions like the nuclear family, connected to institutions like marriage, was connected to a community that is, in fact, mourning this person. So once I got real about how particular the perspective of lynching photographs was, then I felt empowered to really think about, okay, well, what is it that is missing from this picture? It seems to me, though, that also part of what's important about that is doing justice to people who did come through this time period. So people survived this. It wasn't all, it didn't end with the victim's death. People had to find a way to continue to move on and continue to operate in a country that's telling them they're not citizens by having killed this man and claimed that he wasn't connected to family and community, by killing this woman and claiming that she wasn't connected to family and community. So they had to find a way to move on, and I felt like part of what we need to do is pay attention to what artifacts were left to show that people found ways to move on. So the lynching plays to me represent what is it that you do to make sure that you can still believe that you're a full citizen even though your country is telling you that you're not. So testimony is important in that way. I guess the other thing that you're highlighting about what the book does is it really tries to think about the evidence, the meaning-making power that we get from all kinds of artifacts, all kinds of ways of expressing, right? So embodied practices is the way I talk about it in the book. And part of what I'm interested in there is that you don't simply have artifacts in the form of documents, these plays. These plays also gesture toward embodied practices. So, for example, if you have this written document of a one-act script in which people are debating the quality of their citizenship, the meaning of their identity as Americans, if they're debating in that document, they're gesturing toward the fact that people are debating in real life. And that was one of the important things that I was trying to bring to light in the book, by looking at artifacts in a much more dynamic way, by really trying to think about all the different work that these kinds of documents can do, right? In the same way that those photographs really do work in the world, right? They portray these victims in such a way that makes future victimhood for other people really possible. I mean, in a real material way. So if those documents can do lots of dynamic work, then we have to be dynamic in the way that we understand not only how that's functioning, but understand how people are surviving that dynamic work. So those are kind of complicated ways to talk about what I'm trying to do in the book around that question of testimony, but that's just how multifaceted I'm trying to be in the way that I think about artifacts and documents and images in the book.
Yeah. And I think it ties into what you were saying earlier about how we need more sophisticated narratives about how we talk about the experience of Black communities in general, and of violence, the experiences of violence, specifically the ramifications of violence.
So can I add one other thing on that?
Absolutely.
So the other thing you have me thinking about is, because the question sort of had to do with my deliberate choices about the materials that I look at in the book. And part of what struck me early on in the research for the book was the moment when I really kind of settled into the understanding of how theatrical lynchings were. People had talked about them as theatrical in some ways, but hadn't really mined that fact for everything that it could mean. And so I guess that's part of what I feel like the book is doing. The book is saying, okay, if lynching is theatrical, if mobs turned trees into stages, turned bridges and light posts into stages on which these lynchings occurred, then what kinds of tools and resources were African Americans using to also take on the power of theatricality? Because theatricality really does shape our identities. We perform in order to shape our identities. And I won't try to go into the theoretical framework of that. That's in the book. But theatricality is powerful. So one of the questions I had was, what were Black people doing with the power of theatricality? If they were on the mainstream stage only as buffoons, only very often not as themselves, but in blackface, and whites as blackface in blackface to represent them when Black people weren't actually on stage. So if there was limited access to theatricality on the stage, then what were Black people doing with the power of theatricality? And that's part of, I think, what's going on with looking at these scripts and looking at them as documents, but also looking at them as gesturing toward embodied practices.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I really loved about the book is how you talk about sort of private stages, because Black Americans didn't have access to these public stages for fashioning themselves in the images that they understood themselves in and wanted to be seen as, that they utilized and filled these private spaces like homes and churches and other community spaces to stage the images that they wanted to see of themselves. And you know, this, for me, this ties into what you were saying about creating more sophisticated narratives, because another point that you make, and I'm going to see if I can find like this quote that I just really loved from, I think, your introduction. Maybe you remember where it is, about fully appreciating I found it. Fully appreciating Black expressive culture becomes impossible if readers assume that white oppression was so powerful that there could be no psychic or discursive space for anything other than resisting or protesting. And one of the things that your point about the need for more sophisticated narratives made me think of was precisely what that quote points to, is that so much of, like, what does it mean to be Black in America is, what does it mean to be Black in white spaces? What does it mean to be Black facing white racism? What does it mean to be Black facing white violence? And that's only a very specific aspect of Black experience. And, you know, like you, I think, really persuasively show in the book, it cuts, in the depictions of Black Americans, it isolates us from a family and community context. It's not a question of how we're Black Americans living, it's how we're Black Americans living in the context of whiteness, which is an important question, but not the totality of Black experience. And it's something that I find very, very frustrating about sort of mainstream depictions of Black history, is that they don't take Black cultural production seriously on its own terms. They it's always in the context of resistance to oppression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that continues to be the default setting, right? So part of what you're doing, again, to me, is highlighting the importance of recognizing what our defaults are. What are those unspoken assumptions that we're making? And partly because this time period was so known for being a time of intense violence, that's part of the reason why people feel so invested in saying, okay, let's face the truth about this ugliness, and let's focus on the protest and show that they were resisting. And I think that we have been so invested in showing that we resisted because there's so much mythology about how content we were before in slavery, right? That investment in showing how we resisted has led us to ignore the other things that were just about affirmation. But honestly, in some ways, I think that part of what you're highlighting is also a function of, you know, how history works over time, that first you need certain things to get uncovered and thoroughly, quote unquote, proven before another set of eyes can come through, start taking that part for granted, and then looking for something else. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest there is that I'm very invested in thinking about something beyond protest, thinking about affirmation, but I very much acknowledge that my ability to do that has been because other people have done that other important work. of focusing on protest. But part of what you're articulating that I think is equally important to acknowledge is that part of the violence of being marginalized is how much you are taught constantly not to own that. So very often we will accept that the most important thing for us to know about our past is how we struggled and overcame. We will accept that too, that that's the serious stuff, and that we don't have to pay attention to, I don't know, dance and the life-giving force that that was for our people. We don't have to pay attention to the possibility of pleasure. Joan Morgan, Treva Lindsay, Brittany Cooper, all of those people who are talking about pleasure and the politics of pleasure. We're getting to that point now, I think, in the scholarship because of the crucial work that's been done before.
I wanted to end by talking about your work connecting anti-LGBT violence to lynching, and just don't have a particular question about that. I just wanted to return to that and give an opportunity for you to articulate some of those connections that you've talked about in your work.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Because the piece that you're referring to is called Love in Action. It's about a 30-page essay, and I am very invested in that work. So I appreciate the opportunity to even bring it up. I mean, I think for me, what was important about that work was to really think about what we would call intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw's term, and that we've all kind of understood the importance of, and that we're now trying to walk out through the Why We Can't Wait. But that idea of intersectionality is really what had me thinking about what might be the possibilities for understanding the violence against LGBT communities right now and lynching, because it struck me that there being no accountability for murderers if you can give a gay panic defense, for example. It struck me that there was something important about the fact that that's even possible that tells us something about how we haven't moved that far from the kind of violence that lynching represents. And then, of course, the fact that very often the people who are experiencing this anti-LGBT violence are also people of color. So again, that intersectionality becoming really important. But ultimately, I think part of why I'm invested in that work has to do with success too, because we've constantly seen these strides, right? And even last summer, the Supreme Court tried to suggest that the reason there wasn't any need for any further protections for LGBT marriage or anything else had to do with the fact that, well, the polls show that people are for you people, you people, right? The polls show that so many people have accepted the idea of gay marriage. How could you possibly need any protection from us? And that was kind of another flag for me that the strides that are being made, whether people consider it a victory or not, you know, to have don't ask, don't tell struck down, right? We can argue whether that's a victory or not. But victories like that just kept coming, and yet the violence against the communities kept coming too, and was somehow being erased and forgotten. And so for me, that had everything to do with what I had just learned about lynching in terms of success being the thing that brings you violence. So I would say that that's part of why I'm so invested in that work. And if we can be more honest about those dynamics, again, I think it would take us far. The other respectability piece of this, right, this is also related to my investment in having us really trouble respectability, because the debate being framed around gay marriage very much has to do with we're just like you. And by studying the degree to which anti-LGBT violence very much reminds me of, in ways that I can lay out in that essay, lynching, then that also tells me that the argument of we're just like you and recognize us based on that will not quite work. And so I was invested in trying to think through that for that reason too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely sparking connections for me. I actually I wrote a piece last summer when the Prop 8 and VRA, the Voting Rights Act, rulings came down basically in the same week, and you have the same Justice Kennedy, voting one way on the VRA, basically saying we don't need this kind of protection anymore for African American voters and other voters of color, and on the other, still being able to see the need for that protection, and how I was really interested in that that seeming contradiction within this one justice. How is he able to see that this community needs protection in this one instance, but not in this other instance? And I think the issue of success is exactly, at least part of that the perception that, well, the civil rights movement has achieved all that it, set out to achieve, which is not true. Yeah. But that perception then becomes reason why marginalized communities no longer need any, equal protection under the law. Right?
And that becomes violence in itself. Right? So the violence of stripping that away, that it actually becomes the site of violence. So you don't need the Voting Rights Act section that operated so well because it's been successful and so on. The stripping of that protection becomes another kind of violence on top of everything else. So I think the success issue cuts a lot of different directions, actually. So.
Well, since our tech is, I think our tech is telling us that it's time to wrap up. But I really appreciate Professor Koritha Mitchell making time for this really fascinating discussion and this rich discussion. Hope that you will come back in the future to chat, have a news and then chat again. And for people who are tuning in at the end, this was a chat on Living with Lynching, which is a book by Professor Koritha Mitchell, an English professor at OSU. And I want to thank her again for her time and for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.